I learned to recognize death not by silence, but by the way the hands went cold first. In that winter, the difference between red and white lasted only as long as a man could breathe. After that, there were only bodies, cold ones, failing ones, ones we tried to keep alive with hands that had long since lost their feeling. The war continued outside, but inside, it became something quieter. The coal arrives on Tuesdays, when it arrives at all. I learned to mark time this way during that winter, not by dates on a calendar that no one bothered to change anymore, but by the rhythm of shortages. Tuesdays for coal, if we were fortunate. Thursdays for the medical wagon from the commandeered pharmacy on Nevsky Prospect, though it came less often as January wore into February. Sundays meant nothing, except perhaps a few hours when the shelling paused. And in that pause, you could hear the wind properly, howling down from the Gulf of Finland with nothing to stop it. I am Anya Morozova. I was 27 that winter, though I felt decades older. Before the war consumed everything, I worked in the Putilov factory, standing at a loom for 12 hours while my fingers flew across thread that would become cloth, that would become something useful. I was good at it. My grandmother taught me the trick of letting your hands remember while your mind wanders elsewhere. That skill, it turned out, transferred well to other work. Bandaging, suturing, the repetitive tasks that kept men alive when there was little else we could offer them. The infirmary occupied what had been a merchant's house on the Petrograd side, 3 stories of rooms that once hosted parties where people drank French wine and discussed literature. Now the parquet floors, so carefully laid in herringbone patterns, were stained with blood that had frozen, thawed, and frozen again. We covered the worst of it with sawdust when we could get it. The grand staircase still swept upward with Baroque confidence, but we used it mainly to carry men down from the surgical room on the 3rd floor, carefully, 2 of us to a stretcher, watching for the places where the steps had cracked. I reported for my shift as the winter sun was setting, which meant around 3 o'clock. The city existed in a permanent twilight during those months. Dawn came late and gray, and darkness returned before you'd grown accustomed to the light. I walked from my communal apartment on Vasilyevsky Island, across the frozen Neva, my boots crunching on snow that had been packed down by countless feet into something like stone. The bridge was always the worst part, exposed to the wind, which cut through my coat and the sweater beneath it, and the wool dress beneath that. I wrapped my scarf across my face until only my eyes showed, and still the cold found ways inside. Smoke rose from chimneys across the city, thin gray columns that bent and dissipated quickly. Not enough fuel, so people burned what they could: books, furniture. I heard of one family that had begun dismantling their interior walls. The smoke smelled wrong, too acrid, too chemical. Not the clean scent of birch logs that I remembered from my childhood in Tver, but the desperate combustion of a city eating itself to survive. The infirmary announced itself from a block away by the smell. Carbolic acid, which we used to clean everything we could. Unwashed bodies, because water had to be melted from snow, and there was never enough. Something underneath that I can only describe as the smell of suffering, sweat and fear, and the particular sweetness of infection. You learned not to breathe too deeply. You learned to breathe through your mouth. Olga Petrovna was already there when I arrived, sitting at what we called the intake desk, an elegant writing table that had probably once held poetry and love letters. Now it held our log of patients, each entry sparse. Name, if we knew it. Age, if we could guess. Injury. Time of arrival. The later columns, treatment, outcome, were often left blank or filled with abbreviations we'd developed. Gone meant died. Sent meant transferred to the hospital proper, if they were officers or seemed likely to survive. Vanished meant they'd walked out on their own or been carried out by comrades who didn't trust us. Quiet today, Olga said without looking up. She was perhaps 50, with hands that had delivered babies back when the city functioned normally. Now those hands stitched wounds and administered morphine we didn't have enough of. Her gray hair was pinned severely back, but pieces always escaped, giving her a wildness that matched the wildness in her eyes some days. 6 in the ward, 2 critical. The boy with the chest wound won't make it through the night. I knew which one she meant without asking. 15, perhaps 16, with a bayonet wound that had punctured his lung. He'd been trying to breathe properly for 3 days, each breath a visible struggle that exhausted him further. We'd done what we could, which was nearly nothing. Keep him comfortable. Give him water when he could take it. Hold his hand when the panic came, as it did often. The terror of drowning in his own blood, while his eyes pleaded for help we couldn't provide. I'll sit with him, I said, unwrapping my scarf. The infirmary's front room was warmer than outside, but not by much. We kept fires in 2 stoves, one in the intake room, one in the main ward, and rationed the coal carefully. The other rooms remained barely above freezing. There's tea, Olga gestured to a pot on the stove. Or what we're calling tea. It was hot water with some kind of leaves in it. Not real tea, which had vanished from Petrograd months ago, but something gathered from bushes in the summer garden by women who then sold it for bread or soup or whatever they could get. It tasted like hot bitterness, but it was warm, and warmth was its own kind of wealth. I poured a cup and held it between my hands, letting the heat seep into my fingers. They ached constantly that winter. Everyone's did. The cold worked its way into your joints and settled there. My grandmother would have rubbed them with goose fat and wrapped them in wool, but there was no goose fat, and the wool I had I was already wearing. The main ward occupied what had been a ballroom. The ceiling soared 12 feet up, decorated with plasterwork cherubs that had been painted over with whitewash. Someone's revolutionary impulse, perhaps, to erase the decadence. But you could still see the shapes beneath the paint, like ghosts. The tall windows along one wall had been covered with whatever we could find, boards, blankets, newspaper, to keep the heat in and the sniper's view out. Not that snipers were a constant threat, but they'd made their presence known often enough that we'd learned caution. 20 beds lined the walls, though we rarely had 20 patients at once. The flow was unpredictable. Some nights we'd have 2 or 3. Other nights, after a skirmish or a shelling, we'd have bodies covering the floor because the beds were full and the hallway was full, and there was nowhere else to put them. Those nights I learned that you can walk between wounded men if you're careful, stepping in the gaps, murmuring apologies, trying not to trip on outstretched limbs or medical supplies scattered across the parquet. 6 patients, Olga had said. I counted them as I entered. 2 sleeping or unconscious, difficult to tell sometimes. 1 staring at the ceiling with the fixed expression of someone seeing through it to something else. 2 playing cards on a bed they'd pushed together, using ammunition boxes as a table. And the boy with the chest wound, lying very still, his breathing audible from across the room. His name was Dmitri. We'd gotten that much from the soldier who'd brought him in, a man with sergeant's insignia who'd stayed long enough to see Dmitri settled, then vanished back into the war. Dmitri himself hadn't spoken since his arrival. The wound made speech difficult, and perhaps the pain made it pointless. I approached his bed slowly, letting my footsteps announce me. Some of the men startled easily, their minds still in whatever battle had broken them. But Dmitri only turned his head slightly, his eyes finding mine. They were brown, very dark, with long lashes that seemed absurdly delicate against his gaunt face. "Good evening, Dmitri," I said softly, settling into the chair beside his bed. Someone had left it there, probably Olga during her own vigil. "I've brought tea, though I'm afraid it's terrible. Would you like some?" He made a small movement with his head. No, perhaps. Or perhaps just acknowledgement. I set the cup on the floor beside me and reached for his hand. It lay on top of the blanket, thin and pale, the nails bitten down to nothing. When I touched it, his fingers curled slightly around mine, a grip that held no strength, but conveyed something. Gratitude, maybe? Or simply the human need not to be alone. "It's very cold today," I continued, keeping my voice low and steady. This was what I'd learned to do in the long hours beside dying men. Talk. Not about anything important. Not about the war or the revolution, or whether the Bolsheviks or the whites would ultimately prevail. Just talk. About the weather. About what I'd seen on my walk here. About memories from before, when the world was different. The Neva is frozen so solid that people are walking across it instead of using the bridges. I saw a woman pulling a sled with firewood, and children, can you imagine? Children playing on the ice as if this were just another winter. Dmitri's breathing rattled. Each inhale took visible effort, his chest rising unevenly. The wound beneath his bandages wept slowly, a steady seepage we couldn't stop. Infection had set in 2 days ago, and his fever had climbed despite the cold of the room. His forehead glistened with sweat that would freeze if he were outside. "When I was young," I said, "my father would take me to the Neva in winter to watch the ice fishermen. Do you know them? They drill holes and sit for hours in the cold, waiting for fish that may or may not come. I thought they were the most patient people in the world. My father said they were simply stubborn. He said stubbornness and patience look the same from outside, but feel different from within." One of the card players laughed at something, a sharp bark that echoed off the high ceiling. Dimitri's fingers tightened slightly on mine. Shh, I murmured. It's all right. Just Yevgeny and Pavel. They've been playing cards for 2 days straight. I think Yevgeny is cheating, but Pavel either doesn't notice or doesn't care. The light was fading from the windows, what little there'd been. Someone, Vera probably, our other nurse, lit the oil lamps that hung from hooks along the walls. The warm glow they cast was kinder than daylight, softening the harsh realities of the ward. In lamplight, you couldn't see the details so clearly. The bloodstains became shadows. The men's faces lost their sharpest edges of pain. My grandmother used to say that winter was when the world rested, I told Dmitri. She said the cold put everything to sleep so it could wake up stronger in spring. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. This winter feels like something else. Not rest. Something more like suspension. As if we're all frozen in place, waiting for a thaw that might not come. His breathing changed, becoming more labored. I could hear the fluid in his lungs, the drowning happening slowly. His eyes moved to my face, and in them I saw awareness. He knew. Of course he knew. The body knows when it's failing. Would you like me to read to you? I asked. I have a book. Poetry. Pushkin. Or I can tell you about my grandmother's village, if you'd prefer. She grew up in a place so small, it doesn't appear on maps. Just a collection of wooden houses in a clearing in the forest, with a stream that froze solid every winter. He made a small sound. Not words, but I understood. Stay. Keep talking. Don't leave me alone in this. So I talked. I told him about my grandmother's village, about the stream and the forest, and the way the snow would pile so high against the houses that you had to dig tunnels to your door. I told him about the winter my grandfather caught a wolf in a trap, and how they'd kept it in a shed until spring, when they released it, half tame and confused. I told him about the first time I saw Petrograd, how enormous it seemed, how the buildings rose like mountains and the streets stretched forever in every direction. The other patients grew quiet as evening deepened into night. The card game ended. Someone coughed, a wet sound that went on too long. Footsteps in the hallway. Vera making her rounds, checking the patients upstairs in what we called the recovery rooms, though recovery was perhaps too optimistic a word. Dimitri's hand in mine grew colder. His breathing grew shallower. These things happened in degrees so small you barely noticed each individual change, but together they added up to something unmistakable. I'd sat through enough deaths to recognize the signs. I kept talking, my voice soft and steady, telling him about spring in Tver, about the way the ice would break up on the river and flow away in great chunks that caught the sunlight. I told him about the first flowers, tiny purple ones that pushed through the last snow. I told him about birdsong and green leaves and warm rain. His eyes stayed on my face. I don't know what he saw there. I hope it was kind. Somewhere around midnight, his breathing stopped. There was no drama to it, no final struggle. One moment he was breathing, badly but breathing. The next moment he wasn't. His hand stayed warm in mine for a while after, or perhaps that was my own heat I was feeling. I sat with him for another hour until Olga came to check on me. She looked at Dmitri, looked at me, and nodded once. "I'll get the sheet," she said. We wrapped him ourselves. This was work we could have left for the orderlies, but we rarely did. It seemed important to perform this final service ourselves, to handle the dead with the same care we'd given the living. We wrapped Dmitri in a clean white sheet, or as clean as anything was in that place, and carried him to the cold room in the cellar where bodies waited for collection. The cellar was full. Bodies lay in rows, wrapped in sheets or blankets, or sometimes just their uniforms. They froze solid down there, which preserved them, but also made them strange and terrible, like statues of the dead. We laid Dmitri in the only open space, against the far wall, and I stood for a moment looking at the shape of him under the sheet. "Red or white?" Olga asked quietly. "I don't know," I said. "Does it matter?" She was quiet for a moment, then, "No, I suppose it doesn't." We climbed back up to the ward, our breath clouding in the stairwell. My hands ached from the cold of the cellar and from holding Dimitri's hand for so many hours. I flexed my fingers, trying to work warmth back into them. The night stretched ahead, hours more before my shift ended at dawn. I poured another cup of knot tea and returned to the ward, to the remaining 5 patients, to the work of keeping people alive in a city that seemed designed to kill them. Outside, snow had begun to fall again. I could hear it against the covered windows, a soft whisper that almost sounded peaceful. If you didn't know better, you might think it beautiful, this white winter, this sleeping city. You might not guess at the bodies in cellars, the families huddled in freezing apartments, the slow starvation, the violence that erupted in pockets like ice breaking. But I knew better. We all did, those of us who worked through the nights in places like this. We knew what winter meant that year. Not rest, not beauty, just cold and death, and the question of who would survive to see spring. The morning came without ceremony, the way it always did. One moment the darkness was absolute, the next it was merely deep gray, and eventually the gray lightened enough that you could see across the room without a lamp. Dawn in February, such as it was. My shift ended at 6, but I stayed until 7, finishing the records from the night. Olga had already left, walking home through streets that were safer in daylight, though safer was relative. Vera took over, yawning as she removed her coat and scarf, revealing the layers beneath. 2 sweaters at least, possibly 3. We'd all learned to dress like this, wearing everything we owned at once. "How was the night?" she asked, though the answer was always some variation of the same. "We lost the boy with the chest wound, Dmitri." She nodded, unsurprised. "The others?" "Stable. Pavel's leg is healing well. Yevgeny's fever broke. The new man, the one with the head wound, he woke up twice, confused. Didn't know where he was." "They never do," Vera said. She was younger than Olga, perhaps 35, with a face that must have been pretty before exhaustion carved lines around her eyes and mouth. "Any arrivals?" "No, it was quiet." Quiet nights were both blessing and curse. Fewer wounded meant fewer deaths, but it also meant the fighting had moved elsewhere, or paused, or intensified to the point where the wounded weren't making it to us at all. You couldn't know which, and worrying about it changed nothing. I pulled on my coat, which I'd left near the stove to keep warm. It was a small luxury, that warmth, the way the fabric held heat for a few minutes before the cold reclaimed it. I wrapped my scarf carefully, tucking the ends into my collar, and pulled on my mittens, knitted by my mother before the war, back when wool was something you could obtain without trading away half your bread ration. "Be careful," Vera said, the parting phrase we all used now instead of goodbye. "You as well." The street outside was empty, except for a woman sweeping snow from her doorstep, with a broom whose bristles had worn down to almost nothing. She didn't look up as I passed. People had stopped acknowledging each other unnecessarily. Eye contact invited conversation. Conversation invited questions. Questions invited lies, or truths you didn't want to hear. The walk home took me past the bread queue, which had already formed despite the early hour. 24 people, maybe more, standing in a line that stretched from the distribution point, a former bakery, down the block and around the corner. They stood with the patience of those who had no choice, wrapped in whatever they owned, their breath creating small clouds that dissipated immediately in the cold air. I'd stood in that line myself, many times. You learn to stamp your feet to keep the blood moving. You learn to ignore the cold creeping up from the ground through your boots, the way it settled in your toes and fingers, and refused to leave. You learned not to think about how long you'd been standing, because thinking about it made it worse. You just stood and waited, and hoped the bread wouldn't run out before you reached the front. The ration had been reduced again last week. 200 grams per person per day, down from 300. 200 grams was perhaps 4 slices, if sliced generously. It was supplemented by whatever else could be obtained. The thin soup at the factory canteen, the occasional potato, the mysterious grain that appeared sometimes and was rumored to be meant for horses. We ate it anyway. Hunger made you less particular. I'd learned to eat slowly, making each mouthful last, chewing thoroughly to trick my stomach into feeling fuller than it was. I'd learned to drink water before meals, to dull the edge of hunger. I'd learned that hunger came in waves, and if you could wait out the worst of it, it would recede to something manageable. Not gone, never gone, but bearable. Past the bread queue, I crossed the Neva again. The ice was thick enough now that people had marked a path across it, a shortcut that saved the walk to the bridge. Footprints packed into the snow showed the way, and I followed them, my boots finding purchase on the uneven surface. The wind here was brutal, nothing to block it, and I bent my head and pushed forward, counting steps to distract myself from the cold. Halfway across, I passed a man pulling a sled. On the sled lay another man, wrapped in blankets, either unconscious or dead. I couldn't tell which, and the man pulling didn't slow to explain. We passed each other like ships in the Arctic, both focused on our own navigation, acknowledging nothing. Vasilyevsky Island rose before me, its buildings dark against the gray sky. Most of the windows were broken or boarded over. Shelling or deliberate destruction, or simply the need for wood to burn. The city was being dismantled piece by piece, converted into fuel or fortifications, or abandoned to the elements. My apartment building had once been yellow, a cheerful color that must have seemed optimistic to whoever chose it. Now the paint peeled in long strips, revealing gray plaster beneath. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the stairwell smelled of urine and something rotting. I climbed to the third floor, my legs heavy with tiredness, and let myself into the apartment I shared with 5 other women. It had been designed for one family. Now we each had a corner or a section of wall we called our own. My space consisted of a mattress on the floor, a trunk for my few possessions, and a hook on the wall where I hung my coat. The window nearby was broken, covered with a board that didn't fit properly, letting in drafts that made the temperature inside barely warmer than outside. 2 of my roommates were still sleeping, or pretending to sleep. One, Katya, sat at the small table near the stove, warming her hands over a cup of something hot. She looked up when I entered. "There's hot water," she said, "if you want." "Thank you." I poured myself a cup and sat across from her. Katya worked in a munitions factory, filling shells with powder. Dangerous work that paid slightly better than other jobs. Her fingers were stained yellow from the chemicals, and she coughed frequently, a harsh sound that seemed to come from deep in her chest. "Quiet night?" she asked. "Quiet enough. You?" "We had an accident. One of the shells went off during filling. Killed 2 women, injured 5 more." I closed my eyes briefly. 2 more deaths in a city drowning in them. "I'm sorry." "They were careless," Katya said, but her voice held no conviction. We both knew that carelessness wasn't the issue. Exhaustion was. Hunger was. Working 12-hour shifts in freezing conditions with inadequate light and faulty equipment was. But carelessness was easier to name than the systemic collapse that made such accidents inevitable. We sat in silence, drinking our hot water. Outside, the city woke slowly to another day of survival. Someone in the apartment above us dropped something heavy, the thud resonating through the ceiling. In the street below, a cart rattled past, wheels crunching on packed snow. "Did you hear about the deserters?" Katya asked after a while. "Which ones?" "The ones they found in the granary on Bolshevik Prospect. Red Army, apparently. They'd been hiding there for weeks, stealing grain." "What happened to them?" Katya made a gesture, quick and sharp. "What do you think?" "Execution, then. Swift justice or swift murder, depending on your perspective. The line between the two had blurred that winter, or perhaps had never existed at all. The revolution promised many things: justice, equality, bread, peace. But what it delivered most consistently was violence. "There's talk of more fighting near Pskov," Katya continued. "The whites are pushing closer. Some say they'll reach Petrograd by spring." "Some always say that." "This time it might be true." I drank my hot water and said nothing. Speculation about the war's progress was a constant pastime, but it changed nothing about our daily reality. Whether the Reds or the Whites ultimately won, we would still need bread, still need coal, still need to survive the winter. "I'm going to sleep," I said, finishing the water. "Sweet dreams," Katya replied, the automatic phrase that had persisted from the old world into this new one, though dreams were rarely sweet anymore. I lay down on my mattress, fully clothed except for my boots, and pulled my coat over me as an extra blanket. The cold seeped up through the floor, but I'd learned to ignore it, or at least to stop fighting it. I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of the apartment, breathing, coughing, the creak of floorboards as someone shifted position. Familiar sounds that had become a kind of comfort. Sleep came in pieces, never deep, always ready to break at the slightest disturbance. I dreamed of the infirmary, of Dmitri's face, of his hand growing cold in mine. I dreamed of the cellar full of frozen bodies. I dreamed of my grandmother's village, the stream in winter, ice so clear you could see fish suspended beneath it, waiting for spring. When I woke, it was already afternoon. The light through the boarded window was that particular gray that meant snow was falling or about to fall. I lay still for a moment, gathering the will to move, to face the cold, to begin another cycle of work and survival. Katya was gone. So were the others who'd been sleeping. I was alone in the apartment, which was rare and therefore luxurious. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from the cold and the hard mattress, and reached for my boots. Before my shift, I had one task to complete, the ration queue. I couldn't put it off any longer. My bread from yesterday was gone, eaten in small pieces throughout the night to keep my strength up. Today's ration was essential, the foundation on which the next 24 hours would be built. I put on my boots, my coat, my scarf and mittens, and went back out into the cold. The queue had grown since morning. I counted at least 50 people now, standing in their patient line, stamping their feet, blowing on their hands. I took my place at the end, behind an old man whose coat had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt, each patch a different shade of brown or gray. The line moved slowly, a few steps every 10 minutes or so. People didn't talk much. What was there to say? We were all here for the same reason, all experiencing the same cold, the same hunger, the same grinding daily struggle. After an hour, I'd advanced perhaps 20 feet. My toes were numb. I couldn't feel my fingers even inside the mittens. The cold had worked its way through all my layers and settled into my core, a chill that no amount of movement could shake. The woman in front of me swayed slightly, then sat down on the snow-covered pavement. "Are you all right?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She looked at me with eyes that didn't quite focus. "Just tired. I'll be fine." But I could see she wasn't fine. Her lips were blue, her skin gray. She was perhaps 40, though it was hard to tell. Hunger aged people, made them look decades older than they were. "When did you last eat?" I asked. "Yesterday, or the day before. I forget." I helped her to her feet. She stood shakily, leaning on me for support. The line had moved again while we'd been down, opening a gap. People behind us murmured their discontent, but no one said anything directly. We all understood that tomorrow it might be one of us sitting on the pavement, too weak to stand. "Stay with me," I told the woman. "We'll get through this together." She nodded, her head heavy on her thin neck. We stood together as the line crept forward. I kept my arm around her shoulders, lending her my strength, such as it was. She trembled constantly, whether from cold or hunger or illness, I couldn't tell. Probably all three. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 2, we reached the distribution point. The woman behind the counter looked as tired as we felt. She measured out the bread mechanically, her movements practiced from doing this hundreds of times a day. "Papers," she said. I showed my ration card, received my 200 grams. The bread was dark, dense, with things mixed into it that probably weren't grain. Sawdust, some said. Ground up acorns. I didn't care. It was food, and food was life. The woman beside me fumbled with her papers, her hands shaking too badly to hold them steady. I helped her, presenting her card to the clerk, receiving her ration. Outside, she looked at the bread in her hands, as if surprised to find it there. "Thank you," she said. "Can you make it home?" "Yes, I think so. It's not far." I watched her walk away, her steps uncertain, and felt the familiar weight of helplessness. I'd helped her get her bread, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. The bread would sustain her for a day, maybe 2 if she was careful, and then she'd be back in the line again, a little weaker, a little closer to the edge. But you couldn't think about that. You couldn't think about the cumulative effect of this winter, the way it ground people down day by day until there was nothing left. You had to focus on the immediate, getting home, eating enough to maintain strength for your next shift, sleeping in whatever hours remained, and doing it all again tomorrow. I walked home slowly, eating small pieces of bread as I went. The flavor was barely there, but the texture was real in my mouth. Something to chew, something solid. I savored each bite, making the bread last the entire walk back. At the apartment, I found Katya returned from her shift, sitting in the same spot at the table, warming her hands over the same cup. We'd developed routines, orbits that brought us into proximity at certain times of day and carried us away again. "Did you hear?" she said as I entered. "They're saying the Bolsheviks are planning a new offensive. They need nurses at the field hospitals." I sat down across from her, unwrapping my scarf. "They always need nurses. They're offering extra rations, double bread and meat twice a week." I looked at her. Double rations would mean survival, not just for me, but maybe enough to share with others, to trade for coal or medicine or the other necessities that slipped further out of reach each day. But field hospitals meant closer to the fighting, meant artillery fire and the risk of capture, meant working in conditions that made the infirmary look comfortable by comparison. "Are you thinking of going?" I asked. "I'm thinking of eating," she said simply. It was the calculation we all made, constantly. How much risk was acceptable for how much reward? How much of yourself could you spend before there was nothing left to spend? "Think about it," Katya said. "They're holding interviews tomorrow at the Soviet headquarters." I nodded, but didn't commit. The infirmary needed me. The patients I knew needed me. Leaving felt like abandonment, even though I understood the practical argument for it. But then, nothing about this winter was about logic or fairness. It was about surviving however you could, making whatever choices seemed least terrible in the moment. I ate the rest of my bread slowly, letting it sit on my tongue, extracting every bit of sustenance and comfort it could provide. Outside, snow fell steadily now, covering the city in fresh white that would turn gray by morning, then black, then be covered again. Layer upon layer, burying everything beneath, while underneath, the city held its breath and waited for spring. Three nights later, they brought in a white officer. It was unusual. We mostly treated Red Army soldiers, or sometimes civilians caught in crossfire. But white forces typically had their own medical facilities in the territories they controlled. For one of their officers to end up in our infirmary meant something had gone wrong with their retreat, or their supply lines, or their faith in their own side's ability to keep them alive. He arrived after midnight, carried in by two men who wore no insignia and wouldn't meet our eyes. They laid him on a stretcher in the intake room and left quickly, before Olga could ask questions. The officer himself was unconscious, his face pale beneath several days' worth of beard, his breathing shallow and labored. Vera and I carried him to the ward. He was heavier than the boys we usually treated, older, well fed before the war, or at least better fed than most. His uniform, though dirty and torn, was of finer quality than standard issue. An officer indeed, though what rank we couldn't tell. Any identifying insignia had been removed or obscured. We laid him on a bed that had been empty since this morning, when Pavel had finally been transferred to the main hospital, his leg healed enough to risk the move. The white officer settled into the mattress with a small sound of pain, still unconscious, his hands curling reflexively against his chest. "Gunshot," Vera said, examining him with practiced efficiency. "Entry wound in the left shoulder, exit wound in the back. No bullet to remove, at least. But there's infection and fever." We cut away his uniform jacket and shirt, revealing the wound. It was several days old, poorly bandaged with cloth that had been white once, but was now brownish with dried blood and seepage. The edges were inflamed, red spreading outward in tendrils that meant the infection was advancing. If we didn't control it, he'd be dead within days, perhaps hours. "I'll get the carbolic solution," I said. "And morphine. This is going to hurt when he wakes up." We worked together in the quiet that came from long practice. Vera cleaned the wound while I prepared supplies. Fresh bandages, which were increasingly hard to obtain, iodine, needles, and thread for stitching. Around us, the other patients slept or pretended to sleep. They'd learned not to pay too much attention to new arrivals. In a place like this, getting attached was dangerous. People left too quickly, one way or another. The white officer woke when Vera began working on the shoulder wound, his eyes flying open, his body jerking back from the pain. I held him down, my hands on his uninjured shoulder, while Vera continued her work. "Stay still," I murmured. "We're helping you. Stay still." He tried to speak, but only managed to groan. His eyes found mine, wide with pain and confusion. They were gray, I noticed. A light gray that looked almost colorless in the lamplight. "You're in Petrograd," I told him, keeping my voice steady and calm. "In an infirmary. You've been shot." We're treating the wound. Recognition flickered in those gray eyes. Understanding, perhaps, of his situation. Alive, but among enemies. Wounded and vulnerable. He stopped struggling, though his body remained tense, every muscle rigid with pain. Vera finished cleaning the wound and began stitching. The white officer's jaw clenched, but he made no sound. I admired that, despite everything. Pain was pain, regardless of which side you fought for, and bearing it silently took a kind of strength. When we'd finished, the wound cleaned and stitched and bandaged, morphine administered. He was conscious, but barely. His eyes half closed, his breathing steadying into something like sleep. We covered him with 2 blankets, all we could spare, and left him to rest. Should we report him? Vera asked quietly when we'd returned to the intake room. It was the question we'd both been thinking. A white officer in a red city, wounded and helpless. The authorities would want to know. They'd want to interrogate him, extract whatever information he had about white movements and plans. And after the interrogation, well, summary execution was the usual outcome for captured enemies, especially officers. Let him recover first, Olga said from her position at the desk. I hadn't realized she was listening. A dead man can't be interrogated. Let him heal enough to survive questioning. Then we'll inform the commissar. It was a compromise that let us maintain our professional ethics while acknowledging political reality. We were healers, but we weren't naive. The revolution had rules, and we existed within those rules, or we didn't exist at all. I spent the rest of the night attending to the other patients, changing bandages, administering what little medicine we had, sitting with those who needed company. But my awareness kept circling back to the white officer, to the fact of him lying there among men who would kill him if they knew what he was. Around 4 in the morning, I found myself sitting beside his bed. The ward was quiet, except for breathing and the occasional cough. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the boards over the windows, whistling through the gaps. The white officer's eyes opened. He looked at me for a long moment, then spoke, his voice rough from disuse and pain. Water. I helped him drink from the cup I'd brought, supporting his head while he took small sips. His beard was dark, with streaks of gray, and up close I could see the lines around his eyes and mouth. 40, perhaps. Old for a soldier, but not for an officer. Thank you, he said when he'd finished drinking. I set the cup aside. How do you feel? Like I've been shot. A small attempt at humor, though his eyes remained serious. Where am I exactly? The Petrograd side, a civilian infirmary. Red territory. Yes. He absorbed this, his expression not changing. I suppose I should thank you for not cutting my throat. We're nurses, not executioners. The distinction seems less clear these days. I couldn't argue with that. The revolution had blurred many lines, turned healers into soldiers and soldiers into politicians, and everyone into potential enemies of the state. But in this room, in this moment, I could maintain the fiction of medical neutrality. What's your name? He asked. I hesitated. Names created connections, and connections were dangerous. But I'd ask the same of dying boys, learn their names as a way of honoring their humanity. It seemed hypocritical to deny him the same courtesy. Anya. Constantine. We looked at each other across the gulf of the Civil War, across the ideological divide that had split the country into red and white, across all the reasons we should be enemies. And in that moment, I saw just a wounded man, tired and in pain, probably aware that he might not survive this. "Will you turn me in?" he asked quietly. "Eventually, when you're stronger." Honest, at least. He closed his eyes briefly. "How long do I have?" "Days. A week, maybe, if the infection clears." "Time enough to heal then, before—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I stood to leave, but his hand caught my wrist, gently. "May I ask you something?" "Why did you become a nurse? For the revolution?" I thought about how to answer that. The true answer was complicated, full of half-reasons and circumstances. But I owed him something approximating truth, if only because he'd asked honestly. I became a nurse because people need care, regardless of politics. The revolution happened around me, not because of me. I just continued doing what I knew how to do. He nodded slowly. "That's more honest than most of what I hear these days. Everyone claims to act for great ideological reasons, when mostly they're just trying to survive." "And you? Why did you join the Whites?" "For much the same reasons you became a nurse. It was what I knew how to do. I was an officer in the Tsar's army. When the Tsar fell and the Bolsheviks rose, I had to choose what kind of Russia I believed in. I chose poorly, perhaps." We were both quiet for a moment, acknowledging the strange intimacy of this conversation. Two people on opposite sides of a war, speaking honestly in the small hours of the morning when defenses were low and pretense seemed pointless. "Get some rest," I said. "You need to heal." "So I can be interrogated and shot?" "So you can live a little longer. That's all any of us can do." I left him then, returning to my rounds, but the conversation stayed with me. There was something haunting about Constantine's resignation, his clear-eyed acceptance of his probable fate. No bravado, no appeals to ideology. Just a tired recognition that he'd made choices that had led him here, to an enemy infirmary where kindness would ultimately give way to political necessity. 2 nights later, Olga made the decision for us. She'd been reviewing the supply logs and noticed the extra morphine we'd used on Constantine's arrival, the extra bandages. Questions would be asked eventually. Better to control the narrative now. "I've sent word to the commissar," she told Vera and me. "They'll come for him tomorrow." I felt something sink in my chest, though I'd known this was inevitable. He's still weak. The infection is under control. He'll survive interrogation, which is all we can guarantee. Olga's face was hard, but her eyes held sadness. She'd made this calculation before, many times. "We've done our job. The rest is politics." That night I sat with Constantine for a while during a quiet hour. The other patients were sleeping or resting, and the ward had that particular stillness that comes in the deep part of night. "They're coming for you tomorrow," I said quietly. He nodded, unsurprised. "I'm grateful for the extra days. Truly. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more." "You gave me what you could. That's more than many would have done." He paused. Then, "May I ask one more favor?" "Perhaps." "If I don't survive the interrogation, when I don't survive it, will you write to my wife? Tell her I died in a hospital, cared for. Let her imagine it was peaceful. The truth would be too hard." I took the paper he offered, an address in Moscow written in cramped handwriting. "I'll try. Thank you, Anya." We sat in silence for a while, two people who should have been enemies, but had found a kind of understanding in the neutral space of suffering. Eventually, I rose to continue my rounds, and he settled back into his pillow, his eyes closing. The commissar's men came the next afternoon, as promised. Two soldiers with hard faces and harder eyes. They weren't rough with Constantine, but they weren't gentle either. They helped him stand, supporting him on both sides, and led him out through the ward. He didn't look back. After he was gone, I changed his bedding and prepared the space for the next patient. This was the rhythm of the infirmary. People arrived, received care, and departed through death or transfer or arrest. We didn't follow them beyond our walls. We couldn't afford to. But that night, I thought about Konstantine's wife in Moscow, waiting for news that might never come, or that would come in the form of an official notice emptied of humanity. I thought about the letter in my pocket, the promise I'd made to send her kinder lies than truth. And I thought about all the other men who'd passed through our care that winter, red and white, believers and skeptics, volunteers and conscripts, and how in the end, in the grip of pain and cold and approaching death, the political distinctions had mattered so much less than the simple human facts of fear and suffering and the need for comfort. The war would continue. Spring would come eventually, bringing its own violence and upheaval. But for now, in the depths of winter, all we could do was continue the work, bandaging wounds, easing pain, sitting with the dying, and trying to maintain some small sphere of mercy in a world increasingly defined by its absence. March arrived with the same cold determination as the months before it. But they were signs, subtle at first, that winter's grip was weakening. The days grew longer, stretching beyond 4 o'clock into 5, then half past. The snow, when it fell, melted slightly during the day before refreezing at night, creating a crust of ice that crunched underfoot differently than the powder we'd walked through for months. The war continued, of course. It would continue through spring and summer and into another winter. But something had shifted in the city's mood, a collective sense that we'd survived the worst of it. The dead were counted, starvation, cold, fighting, and the living began to imagine, tentatively, that they might remain among the living. At the infirmary, our patient flow had changed. Fewer frostbite cases, more conventional wounds from the fighting that intensified as the weather improved and armies could move more easily. We still worked 12-hour shifts, still rationed our supplies with painful care, still lost patients we might have saved with better medicine, or more food, or a world less determined to destroy itself. But there was bread more often now. Not enough, never enough, but the distribution became more regular as supply lines reopened. The rations increased to 300 grams, then to 400 for workers. It was still starvation by pre-war standards, but it was survival, and survival had become our only standard. I never wrote to Konstantine's wife. I kept the paper with her address in my pocket for weeks, taking it out sometimes to look at the cramped handwriting, the promise I'd made. But what could I say? Your husband died in custody, interrogated and executed for fighting on the wrong side of a war that had no right side. Or the kinder lie he'd requested, that he'd died peacefully in a hospital bed, cared for by nurses who'd done their best. In the end, I wrote neither truth nor lie, justifying my silence by telling myself that official notice would have reached her by now, that she didn't need another letter describing another death. But really, I think I couldn't bear to reduce Constantine to words on paper, to package his death neatly for a stranger's consumption. Better to let him exist in my memory, those gray eyes, that quiet resignation, that moment of connection across an uncrossable divide. Katya got the field hospital position. She left in early March, heading west toward the fighting near Pskov, wearing a new uniform and carrying papers that guaranteed her double rations. I helped her pack her few possessions, her hands still yellow-stained from the munitions factory, her cough still harsh and persistent. "Promise you'll be careful," I said, though the words felt hollow. What did careful mean in a war zone? "Promise you'll still be here when I get back," she replied. And we both understood we were making promises we couldn't keep, trading comforting fictions because the truth was too uncertain. After she left, the apartment felt larger, emptier. We'd been assigned a new roommate within days, a woman who worked in the telephone exchange and barely spoke to anyone. She took Katya's spot at the table, her corner near the broken window, and we all adjusted our orbits around this new presence, maintaining the careful distance that made shared living possible. At the infirmary, we received a shipment of actual medical supplies, real morphine, real bandages, iodine that wasn't diluted beyond usefulness. It arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by the same wagon that brought our coal, and for a few hours we allowed ourselves something like optimism. With proper supplies, we could save more patients. We could do our jobs the way we'd been trained, instead of improvising with whatever we could scavenge. "Things are improving," Vera said, inventorying the supplies with an expression close to joy. "They're actually improving." Olga, more cautious, simply nodded. But even she seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had shifted, if not entirely lifted. That week we saved 3 men who would have died a month earlier. One had a compound fracture that we could set properly with real plaster. Another had an infection we could actually treat with the morphine to manage his pain during the worst of it. The third simply benefited from having enough bandages to change his dressings daily instead of every 3 days. Small victories, but we celebrated them quietly, allowing ourselves to feel competent again, skilled, like healers instead of witnesses to inevitable death. The first real thaw came in late March. I woke one morning to the sound of water dripping, a steady rhythm against the board covering our broken window. Outside, icicles were melting, releasing their burden drop by drop. The snow on the streets turned to slush, gray and dirty, revealing the cobblestones beneath. The nieva, frozen solid for months, began to show cracks, dark lines spreading across the white surface like fractures in glass. People responded to the thaw with a kind of cautious energy. There were more people in the streets, walking without quite so many layers, their faces turned toward the weak sun. The bread queues moved faster, people less rigid with cold, more willing to chat with their neighbors. Someone even opened a small market in what had been a bombed-out shop, selling vegetables that had survived the winter in someone's cellar. Wrinkled potatoes, frost-damaged carrots, but real food nonetheless. I bought 2 potatoes with some of my bread ration, a trade that would have been unthinkable a month ago, when every gram of bread meant survival. But now, with spring coming, with the worst behind us, I could afford small luxuries. I boiled the potatoes that night at the apartment, sharing them with my roommates. And the taste, earthy, substantial, warm, felt like proof of continued existence. At the infirmary, the patient mix shifted again. Fewer emergency cases, more recovery cases transferred from the main hospital to free up beds for new wounded. These were men who would live, who needed care, but not constant intervention. It made the work less urgent, but also less grim. We could focus on healing instead of just preventing death. One of these recovery patients was a young man named Alexei, perhaps 20, with a leg wound that had healed crookedly, but healed nonetheless. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but he would walk. He'd been with us for 2 weeks when he asked if he could help with small tasks around the infirmary. "I can't just lie here," he said. "I need to be useful." So we gave him jobs, folding bandages, organizing supplies, helping other patients with meals. He worked carefully, precisely, grateful for the purpose. And in helping him find usefulness, we found it easier to maintain our own sense of purpose. The infirmary wasn't just a place of suffering anymore. It was becoming, tentatively, a place of recovery. In early April, we received notice that the infirmary would be expanded. The city had requisitioned 2 adjacent buildings, both damaged by shelling but structurally sound. With repairs and proper medical equipment, we could triple our capacity. It was the first time anyone had talked about expanding rather than contracting, growing instead of merely surviving. "They're planning for a long war," Olga observed when she told us. "But at least they're planning." We began preparations immediately. Vera and I spent hours taking inventory, determining what we'd need for the expanded facility. I walked through the empty buildings, imagining them full of beds and patients, staffed by nurses and doctors, functioning as a real hospital instead of a desperate improvisation. The work was exhausting, but purposeful. We were building something, instead of watching things fall apart. It felt revolutionary in a different way than the revolution itself had felt. Less about destroying the old world, and more about constructing a new one from whatever materials remained. One evening in mid-April, I walked home along the embankment instead of across the frozen river. The ice was breaking up now, great chunks of it flowing downstream, colliding with grinding sounds that echoed across the water. People lined the embankment to watch, a peculiar entertainment. The river reclaiming itself, winter releasing its hold. I stood among them, anonymous in the crowd, watching the ice break and flow. It was violent in its way, destructive, but it was also necessary. The ice had to break for the river to flow again, for boats to return, for the city to reconnect with the world beyond it. Beside me, an old woman spoke to no one in particular. Another winter survived. It was statement, prayer, and achievement all at once. We had survived. Not all of us. The cellars and mass graves held too many who hadn't. But enough of us. Enough to rebuild, to continue, to face whatever came next. That night at the infirmary, I found myself thinking about all the people who'd passed through during the winter. The boy Dmitri with his chest wound, Konstantin with his gray eyes and his doomed resignation, the woman in the ration queue who I'd helped to her feet, the patients who'd lived and the ones who died, and the ones whose outcomes I'd never learned. Each one had been carrying their own weight of survival, their own calculations of risk and reward, their own reasons for continuing when continuing seemed impossible. And somehow, collectively, we'd made it through the worst winter any of us had ever known. There would be more suffering ahead. The war wouldn't end for years, and each winter would bring its own challenges. But we'd learned something in those frozen months about the capacity to endure, about finding mercy in merciless circumstances, about maintaining humanity when everything conspired to strip it away. I sat at the intake desk, updating records by lamplight, listening to the sounds of the ward, breathing, sleeping, the occasional murmur of conversation. Outside, water dripped steadily as the last snow melted. Spring was coming, slow and tentative, but coming nonetheless. The revolution had promised us a new world. What it had delivered was this one, broken, struggling, but still breathing, still trying, still finding small ways to care for each other in the gaps between ideology and violence. And maybe that was enough. Not the future we'd imagined, but the one we'd survived into. Not perfect, not even good, but present, real. Ours to shape with whatever strength remained in our cold, stiffened hands. Olga arrived for the night shift, stamping snow, or was it slush now, from her boots. She looked at me across the lamplight, and something passed between us. Understanding, perhaps. Recognition that we'd done what we could with what we had, and that was all anyone could ask. Go home, Anya, she said gently. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start clearing the new buildings. I gathered my things and stepped out into the night. The air was different now, still cold, but with an edge of moisture that hadn't been there during winter's depth. The smell was different too, less harsh, tinged with the scent of wet earth and melting snow. I walked home slowly, in no hurry, letting my body remember what it felt like to walk without hunching against brutal wind, to breathe without pain, to exist in a world that was, degree by degree, becoming less hostile. The apartment was dark when I arrived, my roommates already asleep or pretending to be. I lay down on my mattress, still wearing my coat, but feeling, for the first time in months, that I might be able to remove it without freezing. That the cold had retreated enough to allow for small comforts, small relaxations of constant vigilance. Sleep came easier than it had in weeks. I dreamed, but the dreams were less harsh than before. I dreamed of the river flowing free of ice. I dreamed of my grandmother's village in spring, the stream running clear and fast. I dreamed of bread that was actually bread, and coal that lasted through the night, and the morning when I'd wake to warmth instead of cold. When I woke, it was to the sound of birds. I lay still, listening, trying to remember the last time I'd heard birdsong. Months ago, certainly, before the deepest cold had driven them away or killed them. But here they were, returned or surviving, singing in the weak spring dawn. I got up and went to the window, pulling aside the board to look out. The street below was wet with snowmelt, the buildings across the way showing their true colors instead of being uniformly white. And in the tree outside, a birch that I'd thought dead, small birds hopped from branch to branch, their song thin but persistent. It was such a small thing. Birds singing, spring coming, the world continuing its cycles despite everything humanity had done to interrupt them. But standing there in the cold apartment, listening to those small voices insisting on survival, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not hope, exactly. Hope seemed too large a word, too ambitious. But something like possibility. The sense that the future might contain more than just the endless repetition of winter's hardships. That there might be space for growth as well as endurance, for building as well as surviving. I let the board fall back into place and began preparing for another day. The infirmary would need me. The patients would need me. The work would continue as it always did. But now, at least, I could do it with the knowledge that winter was ending. We had survived the red winter. And that survival, hard won and costly as it was, meant we would be there to see what spring would bring.